Hey Senpai, it's your Kohai, and today we're going to review Myethos' Fairy Tale Another, Princess Rose, otherwise known as Briar Rose or Sleeping Beauty. This is a 1/8 scale figure with an MSRP of 19,800 yen. I love Myethos figures. I own a few of them. I wish I owned the rest of the Fairy Tale Another series. Unfortunately, they're extremely hard to find, and they also have ridiculous aftermarket prices. I feel like the product that Myethos puts out actually looks like the artwork, and their pricing is actually really affordable for what you get. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at the box. I really like the boxes that Myethos chooses to package their figures in, since I feel like if you so chose, you could display the figure in the box, since it is clear all the way around. It's very simplistic, but in a good way. There are gold accents around, little woodland creatures, roses, vines, which do relate to the figure. On the back is just a picture of her basket. If you were window shopping, there are no prototype photos on this box, and on the bottom is just writing. Since they used foam to package her in instead of clear material, you really can't appreciate what she looks like unless you look her up online. Now, the downside to the box is that if you crease it, it has a very obvious white line, as well as you can scratch and scuff the box pretty easily. Now let's open the box. You can already see this through the box, but here's what the inner packaging looks like. This is probably one of the easiest figures I've had to assemble, since there was literally no assembly whatsoever. You also didn't have to take apart any piece of the figure to take off any of the wrapping. My first impressions are she's extremely shiny. And speaking of that, let's take a look at the paint. Overall, if you're looking at this figure from far away, it's a very pretty figure. When you take a closer look, it starts to fall apart a little bit. So let's take a look at what they did well. By far, the most impressive parts are her bow and her dress, where they use this metallic paint and many different shades such as some golds, oranges, reds. It gets darker here towards the lip. On the inside, they go for more of a pink and orange. Down here at the bottom, we have a defect. There was some paint bubbling, which is unfortunate. Here on her bow, it's mostly a brown color, but in the creases, they did use a darker color. Now, on the back, it's just a green. They really didn't use any shading there. They used some of the same kind of pearlescent paint in her hair, but it's a lot more subtle. It's more in just the curls of her hair. While there's no shading on her skin, they did paint her fingernails, which is a nice detail. I don't think there's really any shading on her shoes, but the lines are really crisp and the flowers do look good. Now, when we start to look at her thorns, it just really falls apart. To me, it is absolutely one single color, no shading. But they did paint the lips on her face, which I do appreciate. Looking at her base, and specifically at the top where the vines are, every leaf is two-toned. You have a lighter color here towards the tip, and then a darker color towards the middle. They attempted to do some shading with the roses, where you have an orange color on the tips of the petals, and then it goes to a yellow color, and then towards the back it gets to a darker green. This effect didn't really show up on the larger roses, but it was effective for the smaller ones. The bow itself is pretty standard, but they did focus on shading here towards the middle. Now we have the little woodland creatures, which actually have a decent amount of shading on their fur. But what is really impressive are the eyes on these woodland creatures. They're extremely crisp, especially on the bunnies here. There's no bleeding whatsoever. They did use the pearlescent paint on the blanket that she's sitting on, but there's really no shading, so it's kind of plain. The basket itself, they tried to use a wash shading so that the darker colors would get in the creases, but overall it turned out pretty light, and I wish it would have been darker so the wicker is more believable. The last little detail to note would be the nameplate, which they did focus on some shading here so that it looks more metallic. The modeling of this figure is where it really starts to fall apart more. The overall sculpt of the hair is impressive, but the execution is not there. There are seams where you can see paint flaws. The bangs are not as crisp as I would like them to be, and there are also pieces added in here. I feel like there's actually a decent amount of detail in the back, But then you kind of get to this weird, clunky piece that doesn't even really look like hair, it just kind of looks like a blanket. And then again, you get into detail here at the bottom. It really just feels inconsistent. You have meh, actually good, what is this, meh, and then good. Where they did a good job is on her dress. We can see all the wrinkles, it's very flowy, it looks very natural. What there is a lot of in this figure is glue. We can see the glue where her right hand meets her dress. There is detail in her fingers on her right hand, but starts to fall apart on the fingertips on her left. We have this kind of weird glue overlay on her shoulder and her chest that thankfully I was able to rub off. We can see the glue in her thorn necklace. Going along with the thorn accessories, in the artwork, they're supposed to be these pointy briars, but in reality, they're just these rounded lumps that don't really look like thorns. They look more of kind of like a strange rope. They're just not very convincing. They also flat out forgot to add flowers to her thorn belt, which is a little disappointing. Another issue that I have is with this bow. The top part looks okay, and then you get to this back piece, which I genuinely feel like is the only place on this figure where they just got lazy. And it's a big old piece of green plastic, and it doesn't look like fabric folded onto itself. What is realistic, though, is their conservation of weight. The blanket is indented where she's laying, which makes sense, but then there's also little indentions where the little bunnies are sitting. Speaking of the animals, they in general have a very realistic molding that is believable. When looking at the basket, we see this seam where the handle meets the bottom. It's kind of hard because real wicker baskets are kind of weaved into themselves, but here we can definitely tell that it's just stuck together. When viewing from the front of the figure, the vines don't look too bad from far away, but when you start to look close up, you can see all these seams where these pieces are just stuck together. And it looks really bad in the back, especially where the vines meet this handle. In general, the base is very clever. Obviously, she's sitting in a wicker basket, but a piece that I think is quite neat is the bottom, where they actually molded it to look like the bottom of a basket, where they could have just put a plain piece of plastic. There's also no extra plastic base here. It's on the inside where they used a plastic shaft to hold her up so that she doesn't sink over time. This figure looks almost exactly like the artwork. The 3D modeler did take a little bit of liberty though, since you can't really see the back of the basket in this artwork, and they added these cute little bunnies right here. What they didn't add though are the little flowers that are supposed to be on her thorn belt. Her pose is constrained by the artwork, but she's just sleeping. I wouldn't say it's a very engaging pose. Her face looks amazing though. You could argue that it's a little bit easier since there are no eyes that have to be printed, but her eyelashes are still centered and there's a lot of detail in her lips. I wouldn't really call this figure kawaii. She's a bishoujo. She's very elegant, which is befitting of a princess. So with that, let's give her a score. Starting with the box, the plastic boxes tend to be my favorite, but in her case, she's too well packaged that you can't appreciate what she looks like, especially when there's no prototype photos, so she gets a 4 out of 5. Regarding the paint quality, I really love the metallic paint, but there's not a lot of shading in general. I do think that it puts her slightly above average with an 11 out of 15. What really hurts this figure is its modeling quality. There are a lot of seams and clunky pieces, but I still think it's above average, so she gets a 9 out of 15. The base is very creative and different, and it can stand alone. But what hurts it is there's not a lot of shading in the wicker basket, so it gets a 9 out of 10. Moving on to artistry, under art versus model, if we're going purely off of accuracy, technically she doesn't have the little roses that are supposed to be on her thorn belt. The thorns on her head are also not sharp. But the 3D modeler did add in the little bunnies in the back piece, which you can't see in the artwork, and it does elevate the figure, so she gets a 9 out of 10. The pose is constrained by the artwork, which makes it fairly stagnant since she is sleeping, but it does look very elegant, so she gets a 6 out of 10. The face looks amazing and is very pretty, so she gets a 10 out of 10. This figure is very bishoujo, and I would be her Prince Charming and wake her up with a kiss, so she gets a 10 out of 10. Moving on to value, objectively she costs 19,800 yen and weighs 1,432 grams, giving her a price per gram of 13.83, which is a 5 out of 5. Subjectively, I would completely agree. Even though she's only a 1/8 scale, it is a fairly large figure, and she stands out, so she gets a 5 out of 5. For playability and displayability, she doesn't have any accessories, and she is a fairly large figure, but she does stand out, and her base can stand by itself, so she gets a 4 out of 5. This brings the total for the Myethos Fairy Tale Another Princess Rose to an 82 out of 100. And that officially puts Myethos' Fairy Tale Another Princess Rose in second place, 1 point above Prince Eugen, which is now in third place. Looking at these two figures side by side, it's obvious that Prince Eugen's paint and modeling quality are on a much higher level than Princess Rose. However, there are two things that really hurt Prince Eugen. One is her cheap plastic base, and the second is the fact that she costs 41,580 yen. For literally half the price, you get a figure that can still stand against Alter's Prince Eugen. I think anyone looking at these figures together would agree that they have a similar presence. So Japanese figure companies need to take note. Myethos is a Chinese company coming in bringing figures with a value in the 90th percentile of what Japanese figure companies are offering, and once they can figure out how to match the quality of figure companies like Alter, it's going to be a serious game changer. Japanese figure companies are going to need to figure out how to stay competitive. If they want to keep charging the same prices, then there's no excuse for poor quality. For example, I really think that Prince Eugen needs an acrylic base. Or they're going to have to lower their prices to be competitive with a figure company like Myethos. Yes, Prince Eugen is increasing in the aftermarket, but the primary driving force behind that is because she has the IP Azurlane attached to her. Whereas almost every single Myethos figure skyrockets in price in the aftermarket because the people are willing to pay for the perceived value that they're getting from the company, which I think says a lot about Myethos. Well, that's it for today's video. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. We have a lot of exciting things planned for you guys in the near future. You can find a way of supporting our channel in the description below. Well, until next time, senpai, bye!